Here we are. So, good morning to you all. This is intimidating. You mustn't all come like this. Anyway, it's wonderful to see lots and lots of old faces, and I'm told that I need no introduction, which is even more worrying than infamy. So let's begin. What we're going to do for this course, which I have to say is a little more challenging for all of us than last year's and time before, we're going to consider this question: what makes an artist great? And that's a question I'm sure all of us have asked ourselves from time to time. Let me introduce you to Jeff Koons, an enormously wealthy, hugely successful American pop artist. You know those rubber long sausage balloons that clowns in circuses walk around and they manipulate them and turn them into all sorts of things, dogs? Well, for $1.2 million, it used to be $1 million, $1.2 million, he will make you a balloon dog out of shiny, glittery metal, some 12 feet tall. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City purchased one of these to put on top of their roof terrace, perhaps to show how with it they really were. If balloon dogs are not to your liking, how about a Michael Jackson? Life-size, wearing his gold and white band uniform with his pet monkey Bubbles, both lying there festooned with flowers, as you can see. Great prices. But does that make great art? And therefore, does that make Koons a great artist? And I'm not going to answer that question. We're on much surer ground with Pablo Picasso, of course. Or are we? We stand in awe, I think, at his enormous proliferative inventiveness, hugely energetic, mercurial, producing masterpieces, icons, like Guernica and Mesdemoiselles d'Avignon. Yet, by his own admission, Cubism, which is the movement by which he is probably best remembered, by his own admission was a cul-de-sac. And Picasso died leaving no clear route for anyone to follow and no clear successor. Which raises the question, what do we mean by what makes an artist great? And so we have to come off the fence, because instinctively, of course, Picasso is great. But it means we've got to define what we mean by that. And I'm sure if I were to carry out a poll among you, we would have probably 375 different definitions of what makes an artist great. All I can do is present to you my own personal definition of what makes an artist great, which is what I hope is going to sustain us through these 5 lectures. And that definition is as follows. For an artist to be great, his work must change the subsequent course of Western art. In other words, open a door. And in this respect, and this respect only, Picasso doesn't quite make muster. Controversial thing to say, I realise. What we are going to do, who we are going to talk about, are people who really did change the subsequent course of Western art. Tomorrow we're going to talk about Rembrandt, whose piercing gaze could see right into the soul of his subjects, changing portraiture forever. The swirling mists and power of nature that Turner used to elevate portraiture from its lowly traditional status in the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries to a different plane. Then we're going to talk about Cézanne, whose lifelong search was for the underlying structure of what he was painting, which made people think an entirely new way about how to represent what they were seeing. And then finally, we're going to end on a happy note with Henri Matisse, whose abolition of perspective and the freeing of colour from its traditional descriptive role allowed the road to pass directly to the abstract, the colour field painters of the mid-20th century. So you can see how these people opened doors and things followed from them. Today we're going to talk about Giotto. Now, Giotto is not a household name to most of you, I'm sure. But he is key to the beginning of the Renaissance. Why? Because for the very first time, The people he represented in his paintings, all of which were in the form of fresco, were real people, solid, with expressions interacting in ways that we could relate to. And in order to appreciate Giotto in fullness, we'll need to do a survey of what was going on in art before Giotto so we can see why he was such a revolutionary character. But why Giotto qualifies as great, by doing what he did, introducing in summary, I think you could say, humanity into his subjects for the very first time, he opened the door to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is probably the most important single development in Western culture. And if he opened the door to that, surely he qualifies to be a great artist, albeit that we know next to nothing about him as a man, and his work was extremely limited, as we will see, at least in volume. And of course the Renaissance led, within 150 years of Giotto, to perhaps the supreme masterpiece of the Renaissance, Michelangelo's depiction on the roof of the Sistine Chapel of God in the act of creating Adam on the sixth day of creation. Why was the Renaissance such a revolutionary thing? In order to answer that question, we need to know what was going on in Western culture before the Renaissance. We need to go right back to the end of the Roman Empire, starting around 300 or 400 AD. And from then until the Renaissance, a period of 800 years, it is probably true to say that man's intellectual and artistic endeavors were cloistered in the monasteries, where the monks decreed that all knowledge was to be found in the Bible. And this 800-year period was described by historians as the Age of Faith. Well, things began to change in about 1200 with this man, a Florentine poet, writer and thinker, Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch. And by studying the ancient texts, he came to the conclusion that God had endowed man with an intelligence and a power to reason, and that man should use that power to reason to further the benefit of mankind. In other words, he opened the door to a heretical concept that God was no longer front and center stage. Man was beholden to God, yes, but man was now beginning to assume center stage, which is what the essence of the Renaissance was all about. He looked back to ancient Greece, looking at the enormous cultural contributions the Greeks had made, and to ancient Rome, the civilizing influence of Rome, and concluded that the so-called age of faith was in fact an age of darkness, whereas the so-called pagans, the Greeks and the Romans, were the enlightened ones. Heretical stuff in his time. Other things were going on as well, which placed man at the center of life. The first thing that was going on were the great voyages of discovery, opening man's eyes to what lay beyond the horizon and the accepted truths of what you could see and what you could hear. Columbus traveled westward, discovering America and a new world, while Bartholomew Diaz traveled down the whole coast of Africa and for the first time plotted the coastline of southern Africa, waiting for Vasco da Gama to continue that onwards to India. New worlds were being opened up. The second, even more significant event was that a young Augustinian friar in Germany, Martin Luther, recognized that he was endowed with intelligence and could think and could question the all-powerful Roman Catholic Church. And he did so in an academic dissertation, not wanting to offend. And he just called that simply the 95 Theses, in which he listed his concerns about the way the church had become commercialized and the general direction in which it was going. And he felt this was wrong. His main concerns, as you know, I'm sure, the selling of indulgences. But he was also concerned that man had the right to communicate directly with God without the intervention of a priest. And furthermore, that for man to be able to communicate with God, he needs to be able to read the Bible in his own language and not in Latin. And these perhaps are the three key things in his 95 Theses, all of which were revolutionary. He got away with his life, but was, of course, excommunicated. And then the third thing linked with Luther was the invention 70 years earlier by Johannes Gutenberg of movable metal type, which allowed a page for printing to be set up very rapidly, and then you could run off hundreds and hundreds of copies. And it is said that thanks to Gutenberg's movable type printing press, that within weeks of Martin Luther publishing his 95 Theses, thousands of copies were distributed throughout Northern Europe, disseminating his ideas. So you can see the powerful forces that were moving man now to center stage. This humanism, if you like, saw its first manifestation not in art, but in literature. The great Florentine poet Dante, in his Divine Comedy, was concerned in his epic poem about man's search for his soul and the search for God. Dante's successor in Florence was this man, Giovanni Boccaccio. And Boccaccio, in his masterwork, the Decameron, placed man front and center. The Decameron is absolutely a fascinating read. It tells the story of 10 young people who left Florence during the plague. In order to escape the plague, they rented a house in the Florentine countryside, and for 10 days they had to pass the time. And how they passed the time was that each of the 10 individual young people had to tell a story, a fresh story every day for 10 days, 10 of them, 100 stories. And so the Decameron is the 100 stories, which put together gives a vivid look into Florentine daily life. So in literature, we're now seeing this humanistic approach coming in as opposed to the Divine Comedy from a generation before. And of course, it was Boccaccio's Decameron that led Geoffrey Chaucer to write the Canterbury Tales. Same idea, but instead of in a house in Florence, they were on horseback on the way from Lambeth to Canterbury. And it was Boccaccio who said, Giotto restored to light the art which had been buried for centuries. And that art, of course, was humanism. And this is where we see in art for the first time the humanistic approach of the philosophy of the Renaissance being manifest. So what was going on in the world of art before the Renaissance in order that we can really appreciate Giotto's unique contribution? Well, let's go back to 325 AD, when the Roman emperor, who was it, who divided the Roman Empire up into the western and eastern half? Constantine, of course. Constantine was in charge of an empire that was overstretched. The western side was being mauled by Germanic tribes. Administration was becoming difficult, and so he had two capitals for the Roman Empire: Rome, concerned with Western Europe, or Central Europe, and the East in Byzantium. Byzantium was an outpost of the Greeks, which he then was renamed in his honor as Constantinople, modern Istanbul, of course. And there were two cultural trends in art which were completely separate: the Western Roman Empire, which only lasted another few hundred years, and the Eastern Byzantine art, which really took over from the Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine art flourished for 800 years. So let's look what was going on in Western Europe in the Western Empire at that time. And here, in the Roman catacombs, is the first representation of a bearded Christ. And it's in fresco on the catacomb wall there. And there you can see the bearded Christ, behind his head, a halo. The halo being a carryover from the Egyptian sun god, the sun disk behind the head of pharaohs and divinities in Egyptian mythology. Next to it is this depiction here of Jacob waking up from his dream when a ladder allows him to ascend to heaven. But visual art really almost grinds to a halt other than for illuminated manuscripts. And here in about 900 AD, we can see what was being done in art in this page from the devotional book of the German so-called Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, painted for him, in which we see Jesus there washing the feet of the disciples against the background of a monastery. and rather turgid-looking figures they are, I'm sure you would agree. But about 1100, the great Gothic cathedrals in Europe were now beginning to be constructed. So artists were then co-opted to design and construct stained glass vignettes of scenes from the Bible in order to educate the masses who were illiterate. And you can see this pictorial style at the time there. Here's a table, figures, looking full face, in profile or slightly at an angle, but devoid of any interaction or any expression. And that was really the state up to about almost the time of Giotto in the Western Europe, state of art. What about in Byzantine, the Constantinople there? You can see in this satellite view of Anatolia, Turkey, you can recognize Cyprus at the bottom there, and the isthmus separating Europe from Asia, where Constantinople was situated. And being right cheek by jowl with Asia, Asian influences, of course, were very strong. And so we start to see the gold and the decorative style of Asian art infiltrating into Christian imagery. The earliest Byzantine picture, representation of art, dates from about 500 AD and is housed here in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. And it consists of a small wooden panel. And here we see the beginnings of Byzantine art. We see the Madonna and Child, but now their halos are embellished in gold, as is the costume that the baby Jesus is wearing, as is the cushion on which the Virgin rests her feet. So you can just imagine in a dark monastery with flickering candlelight, the air of mystique is created by the gold. This Byzantine influence rapidly spread, well, not so rapidly, but it spread over the course of 200 or 300 years to the Adriatic coast of the Italian peninsula. And here in Ravenna, in the San Vitale church, we go inside and we see the full flowering now of Byzantine art situated in Europe. And as we go inside, we can see that all the pictorial elements are now carried out in a mosaic. And Byzantine mosaic is quite different from Roman mosaic. Roman mosaic was constructed from different coloured pieces of marble, and its colours are all soft and subdued. By contrast, the Eastern mosaics are made of glass, brilliantly coloured glass, and pieces of gold, which are laboriously put together to make this startling image. And you can see from about 700 AD, the figures still are very regimented, solid-looking, bland faces without much interaction. High up on the wall of that same church, we have a depiction here of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian with his attendants. And you can see how they're all represented, standing like soldiers in a row there, with some elaborate things in their hands and their costume perhaps a little bit, but all very stark and rather dull. And here on the opposite wall is his wife, the Empress Theodora. And now on her left are two male attendants, and on the right there we can see her female ladies in waiting. And look at the elaborate gold and coloured stones that are depicting their costumes, elaborate certainly, but their faces again are totally expressionless. The rise of Islam brought another element into Byzantine art, and that was in architecture. And here, of course, you recognise St. Mark's Basilica in Venice with the domes of Moorish architecture. And you can see on the facade above the main doorway and the cupolas above the arches on the roof on either side, the same mosaic that we just saw in the Ravenna church. Interestingly, just as an aside, this is a Persian miniature. And so these cultural cross-currents go in both directions. And here we see a depiction of Muhammad on a mythical horse, and out of deference to Islamic sensibilities, his face is left blank. But look and see, he's surrounded, his head is engulfed in a flaming halo, and swooping above him are winged angels. So this intermingling of cultures goes in both directions. And now as we get down to about 1200, just before Giotto, we can see what's going on in Byzantium, particularly in Sicily. And here you can see in this church of Monreale in Sicily, which you may have visited, we've now got the intermingling of the Islamic calligraphy, if you like, the designs, the geometrical designs in the arch that's above Christ's head there, and in the horizontal bands that demarcate the layers of the saints. So the intermingling is now manifesting itself there. And now, for the first time, in the Cefau church in Sicily, we now begin to see a change in the way the face is portrayed. And here, for the first time, we have contouring and shading, giving a little bit of character to the face of Jesus. And interestingly, in this particular example in this church, his eyes are not quite aligned, so that wherever you are standing in the church, he's watching you. Not only was there this east-west divide between the short-lived Roman Empire, which had collapsed in the west by 600 AD, and the Byzantine Empire, which flourished right up until the Turkish conquest of Constantinople in the 1400s, there was also a divide between north and south. And of course, it was the Alps, a formidable geographical barrier, a geological barrier between northern Europe and the Italian peninsula. And so there were two different streams going on at the same time that Giotto was at his mother's knee and becoming an artist. What was going on in the north? Well, the cathedrals were now becoming manifest. They were now being built at a great rate with great architectural and engineering skill, soaring ever heavenwards with stained glass now carrying our vision up to heaven. Similarly, artists were now employed to create tapestries, something new. Why? Because in Northern Europe, the large halls were damp and cold, and lighting a fire in winter did very, very little, and you needed to retain the heat with something soft like a material of a tapestry. Pleasing to the eye, yes, but a practical purpose as well. And tapestry design reached such a peak, particularly in France, at about 1300 or so, that it really reached the realm of high art. And similarly, with illuminated manuscripts, you remember Otto III's rather plain Jesus washing the feet of the disciples with a monastery on top, all a bit stylized and a bit terribly not interesting. Look how that had developed now in the Book of Hours created by the Limburg brothers for the Duke de Berry in France in 1300. And all this was going on at the time that Giotto was learning his trade. One more thing in the north was, of course, in the Netherlands, oil painting was now being exploited by Jan van Eyck and his colleagues, which allowed vivid colours and breathtaking detail to be conveyed, unlike any painting that had ever been done before. But again, the expressions of the individuals tend to be very stylized. As you can see here, we're overwhelmed by the magnificence of the carpets and the capes. What was going on south at the time that Giotto was learning his trade? Well, the first thing to appreciate, of course, is, as you know, I'm sure, Italy wasn't a united country in 1200. It was a collection of duchies, city-states, and republics. And let's start off with what was going on in the most active artistically of those entities, in the Republic of Siena. You can see Siena there, it's in green, about 2/3 of the way up on the western side of the Italian peninsula there, Siena, Republic of Siena, just below Florence. And the leading artist in Siena at the time was Duccio. And Duccio, we can see, this is the cathedral in Siena, and you can see that in Siena, Byzantine style was alive and well, manifest in the west face of Siena's cathedral. Can you see the pinnacles, the pediments there, the triangular bits on the top of the facade, are exactly very similar to the Byzantine mosaics we saw in the interior of the church in gold and coloured glass. Looking, we have to say, a little incongruous next to the Gothic-looking pinnacles, but there we are. But when we go inside, we see what the master of Siena, Duccio, is doing. And he has created this, Byzantine in style, absolutely. It's a huge altarpiece for the main altar in the cathedral in Siena, in 3 parts. The top part is more decorative. The main part, of course, is the central portion with the Madonna and Child and the saints on either side. But I want to draw your attention particularly to the predella, the long strip on which the main body of the altarpiece stands. And as you can see, even here, it consists of lots of little pictures. And this gives us an idea of how Duccio conceived of portraying man in painting. And on the back, there are 40 of these, and on the back, the story continues. They're all the story of the life of Christ. And I want to look at one or two of those in detail, because we're going to contrast that in a moment with what Giotto was doing. And as we look at the first one of these little things, it's a depiction of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Well, what could be a more dramatic episode than that? And here we have Lazarus duly risen, wrapped up in his burial shroud, standing bolt upright with his eyes wide open. And in truth, that's about it. I think you would agree, knowing the momentous vision that this conveys, that its depiction, in fact, falls a little flat. And here again, we have Jesus talking to Peter and Paul on the Sea of Galilee. They've just been fishing. There's the fishing net. And from the gestures of their hands, we imply they're having a conversation. But somehow they seem to be frozen in time. Duccio had a young pupil, Simone Martini, and his young pupil specialized in the application of gold leaf. He did it on a clay bed, and then with a hammer gently tapped the gold leaf so that it stuck to the clay, not so hard that he fractured it. It was a great skill, and he was the supreme master of gold leaf, a youngster, Duccio's pupil. But more than the gold leaf, we can see this is in a side chapel of the Siena Cathedral, where we saw Duccio's grand altarpiece. This is in a side chapel, smaller by far, but even more magnificent. And now for the first time, we're beginning to see emotion creep into these stylized figures that we've been looking at for the last 10 minutes. The picture, of course, is a depiction of the Annunciation, the angel telling the Virgin Mary that she will bear the Son of God. Well, that's pretty momentous information to have, and the Virgin appropriately recoils in horror at that prospect. And so we're beginning to see now a little emotion creep into Western art in the hands of this young man. And here she is in detail, looking rather coy. What was going on to the north of Siena? And that, of course, was Florence. Florence was rapidly becoming the most powerful economic state in the region, so much so that its trade with other states led it to produce its own coin with which it did its trade, that coin being the florin. With their wealth, they were building a new cathedral, not yet built at the time of Giotto, and a new town hall, which was City Hall, which was still in design stage. And of course, with the rise of the Medici family, not only did the Florence they inherit have to be the most powerful economic force on the Italian peninsula, it also had to be the most cultured. And of course, they bankrolled the Renaissance once it was in full flood. The leading artist in Florence at the time, before Giotto really came into his own, was Cimabue. And you may be forgiven for thinking that Cimabue was actually working in Siena, very much beholden to the Byzantine imagery, as you can see there. But here, even Cimabue is trying to do something a little more human. We saw how Simone Martini had made the Virgin recoil at this startling news. And here Cimabue now is carrying out a gesture that any mother will recognize, the baby reaching up to touch her cheek. Notwithstanding that the poor baby really looks a little sad, his head is much too small, he's prematurely balding, and he looks for all the world like a 40-year-old who needs some of that. What's that stuff you put on your bald patches for hair? And then, of course, there are the Virgin's hands, which look bizarre. There's no other way to describe them. But he's trying. So this is the scene on which Giotto was now going to take over. And this Cimabue, this is in Dante's Divine Comedy, an epic poem, deals with purgatory, among other things. And in his purgatory section of the Divine poem is this: he devotes a verse to Cimabue and to Giotto. Cimabue was once thought to hold the field as painter. Giotto is now all the rage, dimming the lustre of the other's flame. So if you have the imprimatur of Dante, then there's presumably something to this fellow Giotto. What do we know about him? Next to nothing. He's not a household name, as I'm sure you know. This is an image purporting to be Giotto in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, which is almost entirely speculation as far as we can tell. What we do know about him is that he was, according to Vasari, the first art historian who did a biography of the great artists of his time, according to Vasari, he was a shepherd boy with amazing talents as a painter, but everything that Vasari wrote has to be taken with a pinch of salt. There is scholarly evidence to suggest that his father was actually a blacksmith in the city of Florence itself. He was married and had many children, and that's about it. What we do know is that when he was 30 years old, he took a trip to Pisa, and in Pisa he encountered this sculpture by Niccolo Pisano, the leading sculptor of the day, in the baptistry of the cathedral. And if you look at those figures in this low-relief sculpture and think back to the images that we've been looking at so far in painting or fresco, this is night and day. And Giotto saw this, and we can only assume what he thought. But this is a vivid interaction of a whole host of people and animals. He went on that same year to visit Rome. And there in Rome he came across, in a church on the far side of the river Tiber, the Santo Spirito Church, this Byzantine work in which the Annunciation is again represented. And I suspect what caught Giotto's eye in this, created by Pietro Cavallini, is the actual angel rather than the Virgin who's sitting there just a bit coy, not terribly interesting. But look at the angel. The gesture is somehow fluid, the weight is nicely proportioned between the 2 feet, and look at the way her toes curl around the rock. Something completely new. And I suspect that Giotto had made those observations, and this would influence him as he conceived of how to represent the human form in fresco, which was his medium. A few years later, he was approached by Enrico di Scrovegni. He was a Paduan banker. Padua was a wealthy university town not very many kilometers from Venice in the Republic of Venice. And Scrovegni asked Giotto if he would decorate the interior of the chapel he had built as the prayer and burial chapel for the Scrovegni family. It was built on the site of an old Roman arena, and it's sometimes referred to as the Arena Chapel. And so Giotto obliged, and as you go in, you are simply blown away. This is the only site of Giotto's authenticated work. So everything that's in there is what Giotto's reputation was based on. As we go inside, we look at the starry sky above, and on the west wall there we can see the Last Judgment. And on the left-hand side, those who are deemed worthy are rising up to heaven, and on the right-hand side, particularly on the bottom quadrant there, those who are not worthy descend into hell. All around the sides, there are individual panel paintings, some 37 of them in all. Each one with its own individual frame, arranged in 3 tiers. In the top tier, we have the life of the Virgin Mary going round the whole chapel. And in the top left-hand example here, we see St. Joachim, her father, and St. Anne, her mother. In the second tier, going all the way around the chapel, is the life of Christ depicted in these individual paintings, frescoes. And at the bottom, the Passion of Christ, the crucifixion, the entombment, and the resurrection, likewise going all the way around. And they're all in a remarkable state of preservation. And as we look at these, I think it will jump at you now as to what a revolutionary step Giotto had taken. Around the bottom, I should just say, I omitted just to mention, around the bottom, in black and white there almost, a whole frieze in which Giotto has painted the 7 virtues and their opposites. Here, for example, fidelity and infidelity. Fidelity standing robust and proud, and infidelity about to take a fall. But let's look now at the detail of what Giotto was doing, knowing what all these other characters had done before, both in Siena and indeed even in Florence. Here we have one panel which is where the disciples are discussing the betrayal of Judas. There is Judas with the devil behind him with his arm egging him on. But they are engaged in an intense conversation, I think you would agree. Their hand gestures are realistic. Their robes hang in natural folds. And Giotto has placed us, the viewer, slightly lower than they are, so we look up to them, so it's as if we're actually present eavesdroppers at their conversation. Here in another panel, perhaps the most striking of all, although not quite as well preserved, is Judas and the kiss. And this is really a seminal moment, of course, in the New Testament story. And there's Judas in gold with an exaggerated gesture embracing Christ, an exaggerated look of intensity and sincerity with a furrowed brow, to which Christ responds with a steady, cool gaze. And it's a scene of great action. Weapons are raised, torches are lit, the crowd are closing in on the 2 protagonists. So there's a tension in the air, not just by the very action of the 2 main participants. And there's even more, a little vignette if you like, a priest on the right side there in this purple robe, pointing a finger towards the left-hand side of the screen, where you can see, covered by a golden halo, St. Peter slicing off the ear of the priest's assistant. So much going on, so little precedent to justify what he was doing. And here a rather darker picture. It's the slaughter of the innocents, a dark subject rendered in dark colours, as you can see. And there we can see a soldier, sword poised, grabbing an infant by the ankle, trying to yank it away from the mother, who is pleading with her eyes for him not to kill her child. But too late for the other children, the bodies lying on the floor there, as you can see. And here the entombment, again not too well preserved, but highly poignant, I think. We can feel the grief of the participants here. They're not stylized soldiers in a row with blank faces. These are real people feeling real grief. And our eye is led down by this wall, as you can see, down to where the Virgin is supporting the head of her dead son, speaking to him with her eyes. And at the lower end there is Mary Magdalene, contemplating the stigmata of where the nails were driven through Christ's feet. And above, angels swooping and wailing. So it's a very, very powerful scene, given that this was in 1300. As I said, that was the only output that we've seen. We've just looked at 4 or 5 examples at some length to give you a feel for how revolutionary this man was. Why was he revolutionary? He endowed them with some physicality. He endowed them with emotion. In other words, he made them human, fully consistent with the spirit of the times of the early Renaissance, which is putting man towards the center of the stage. So here we have the pictorial equivalent, the very beginning of the Renaissance, if you like. This is the upper church of St. Francis of Assisi. You may have visited it. It contains lots of frescoes, some of which are said to be by Giotto, but most art historians question that attribution. So I think we're just left with a Scrivegni chapel. And that's about it for this man who really held the key that unlocked the door to the Renaissance and its full flowering. 3 years before Giotto died, he was appointed architect for the cathedral, the Duomo in Florence, which was still not yet under construction. And he was charged with building the campanile to house the cathedral's bells, and his original designs were only carried out as far as the lower quarter was concerned. The rest is all by another hand. Giotto died in 1337 at the age of 70. And we've seen really his output. And yet what a seminal figure he was. He was buried by the front porch of a church which has since been demolished to make way for the cathedral. And so now Giotto has no known grave. A decade or so after Giotto died, the Black Death, bubonic plague, descended on Florence and within a few years had wiped out 60% of the Florentine population. All artistic activity ceased for 50 years. And then in 1401, we now see the successor of Giotto. Remember I said my personal definition, and it is personal, is that to be a great artist, you have to point the way for your successors to go off in a new direction. And this is exactly what Giotto did. Not only did he revolutionize what had gone on before with the humanity of his subjects, he's now showing the way for his successors to build upon what he was doing. And the successor here was Masaccio, Florentine artist who lived only 27 years. And in that very short life, he carried Giotto's baton further into the development of Western art, way beyond anything that one would have anticipated in such a short space of time. And he developed on Giotto's art in three ways. The first was in relation to perspective. Giotto wasn't great on perspective, but I think in all those scenes that we saw, it looked a pretty realistic setting. You wouldn't really quarrel with it compared to the flatness of the Byzantine figures that we saw a little earlier. And he was stimulated in his search for enhancing perspective in painting by reading the works on perspective by Brunelleschi, who designed the dome of the cathedral in Florence, as you know. And Brunelleschi had also designed this church here, which is the Santo Spirito church in Florence, which for the first time had the soaring aspect of perspective leading down to a niche at the far end. And as you stand at one end of the church, it's almost, I suppose, nothing to do with the Gothic cathedrals. This was a completely different cultural track. But I suppose it was the same idea, that you wanted to be in a soaring environment in a place of worship. And the niche at the end was something that engaged Masaccio. And so he painted this. For the first time, we're now seeing real perspective coming into paintings. Giotto had a go at it, and not too bad. He was the specialist in the humanity. But now we're seeing the development of Giotto in the form of perspective with Masaccio's depiction here of the Holy Family. There is Christ suspended under a barrel-vaulted ceiling, above hovering God the Father. And to one side, his mother, the Virgin, and on the other side, John the Evangelist. And as is customary at the time, the two donors who paid for this fresco are kneeling on either side. The space is so vivid that when you see this fresco, you could almost imagine that the figures inside could move about if they so choose. It is so real. The second way he enhanced perspective was to introduce for the first time the optical illusion that the further away you look, the bluer things look. And here we can see the distant hills there have become blue, and beyond that even bluer still. And this device was much loved by Leonardo da Vinci, of course, in many of his paintings. But not only that, he enhanced the sense of perspective, by which I mean also the solidity of the whole arrangement of the figures here, by bringing in light for the first time coming in from the right side. And in doing so, you can see that shadows have now fallen on the ground. And this was entirely new. No one had thought of that before. And you can see how effective it is. The two figures on the right there, particularly the most extreme right there, is almost in shadow entirely himself because the sun is coming from the back, whereas these figures, more towards the center, are illuminated. And there's a sort of three-dimensionality simply by this clever device of bringing light coming in. And of course, this will be exploited further by Caravaggio and others, and we call that chiaroscuro. And so there he's doing that. The second way Masaccio enhanced the work of Giotto was in the solidity of the figures. You could see now, unlike the Byzantine figures who were all flat, we could see that Giotto's figures were rounded and solid and real people. Masaccio now takes it a stage further, making them muscular to the point of being monumental. And almost all of Masaccio's work, because of his short life, was confined to the Brancacci Chapel in Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, which you may have seen. And it was that church and that chapel that Michelangelo's teacher, when he was an apprentice sculptor, sent Michelangelo to look at this picture, painted in fresco by Masaccio, in order to see how musculature can be conveyed. And here is another example. It's a double picture because on the left-hand side, the state before, when fig leaves were placed on the order of a pope who was offended by those, that even happened in the Sistine Chapel, you will remember. The fig leaves are removed, the candle wax that had gone up to the ceiling had been scraped off. And here we see Masaccio now, the third contribution. He's got the perspective he's built on Giotto, he's got the physicality that he's built upon Giotto, and now the emotion he's increased on Giotto. And here we have almost a histrionic example of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Paradise. Adam putting his hands over his face in shame at the fate that has befallen, and Eve is simply beside herself with grief. And now, having developed all these devices, it didn't stop there. Giotto opened the door to Masaccio. Masaccio now opened the door, and it was not the door that Masaccio opened, it was floodgates. And now hugely talented artists of the Renaissance, each with their own sensitivity, created their masterpieces. Here, a Dominican friar, Angelico. He was given the name Angelico because he painted soft colours, delicate subjects, full of humanity and sensitivity, as if his works had been painted by an angel. And then there's Piero della Francesca, a devotee of Vitruvius. You remember Vitruvius, the Roman architect who thought that he was an architect, that all ratios had to have a certain relationship one to another, and that this was coming from the divinity. And Piero della Francesca picked up on that. And all Piero's pictures, completely in contrast to Fra Angelico's, are solid people, silent, solemn, and the ratios of the picture are essential to the spirituality that he wanted to convey. Here, for example, we can see Christ is centered, at the head in the center of the picture, and it's divided horizontally. Can you see the white dove there with the wings outstretched? Segregates the upper third of the picture from the lower two-thirds, and the upper level of Christ's garment segregate the middle from the lower third. And so these are the divine ratios. So the divinity in Piero Francesca, it's a bit stiff to my liking, but nonetheless you can see where he was coming from. The spirituality was in the ratios. And then there was Botticelli. And his own sensitivity there was everything had to be lyrical and flowing. And here his subjects were not religious so much as from mythology. And here the birth of Venus coming fully formed on a shell, arriving on the shore, the wind in her hair, the angels blowing on the side there, everything billowing, flowing, languid and lovely. And then there was Uccello, who was trained as an architect. And as you're an architect, everything's in perspective and ratios again. So here's Uccello, the Battle of Romano, his large, huge masterpiece here, in which everything is to do with end point. Can you see how the lances on the left point up towards the top of the picture, how the haunches of the horse that's kicking his rear legs up there point up there. So these are all different sensitivities, all Renaissance manifestations, but all portrayed in a way peculiar to each of these very individual Renaissance artists. And then there's Andrea Mantegna, the only one who wasn't a Florentine, interestingly. He was a Venetian, but all the others were from Florence. And here we have perspective, this foreshortening, the most dramatic of all foreshortenings, copied by Salvador Dali in his Flying Cross, I'm sure you remember. But here's Mantegna's Christ looking for all the world as if he's carved in stone. And that leads us perhaps to the two high points of the High Renaissance, and in my book, the two finest works of art that Giotto opened the door to. Leonardo's Da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks in the National Gallery in London, where when you see the picture, it's not very, very big. You can see the blue at the back there that was pioneered by Masaccio. And if you look at the Virgin's face, there is somehow a push-pull about it. It's the look, the gaze of a loving mother, but at the same time a little distance between her and her child, because she realizes this is not an ordinary child. And then, of course, we reach the high point of the High Renaissance entirely with Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, as we saw. As I was putting this talk together, which was a challenge, and a challenge for you, and I feel bad for you having to listen to all this, but it was a challenge for me to how to integrate the Renaissance with a man about whom we knew next to nothing, who produced hardly any work at all, as the main focal point. But I hope that I've succeeded in saying where he comes in terms of the perspective of Western art. As I was putting this together, something struck me. And what struck me was how little the Renaissance really had built on what went before. Do you remember that quotation I put up of Boccaccio saying Giotto restored to light what had gone before? So I inquired for my own interest what was it that had gone before, and I was blown away, as I think you will be. This is an onyx dish. It dates from 330 BC, found in Hellenistic Egypt. So it's Greek, culturally Greek, found in Egypt. What does it depict? It's 8 inches across, so the bit that matters is only 6 inches across. And in that 6 inches, we see 7 figures. The largest is on the left there, a muscular man with a beard and crinkled hair, holding a horn of plenty balancing on his thigh, as you can see. But look at his rippling muscles, and look at the way the beard